So this next panel, Advancing Freedom and Progress, is related to the last panel. The last panel was about, okay, what is the public actually thinking about these issues, and how do we engage them, and how do we align them, bring them aboard, or apply our values to the challenges they're facing? This next panel is the practitioner panel. So here you have three people who in various domains are actually doing the work of advancing freedom and progress in different ways. We have Heath Mayo, who runs Principles First, which is a grassroots organizing group that's trying to advance the principles of freedom and progress in the constituencies that they support. Then I think next is John Hood, who runs the John William Pope Foundation, which as a philanthropic organization is trying to support institutions that advance freedom and progress. And then at the end, Brian Hooks, the president or chairman and CEO of Stand Together, which is doing a lot of interesting work around elections, among other things today. Of course, they do a lot of things, but the stuff they're doing around elections, I think, is particularly interesting for the context of this panel. So, Brian, let me just start with you, and then we can work our way back. Just tell us a little bit about what you're doing and what you're finding, and now that you've been in this for a bit, this new effort, what are you learning about it?
Well, first off, Avik, thanks for having us. And I've been called a lot of names in my career with the Charles Koch Foundation and Stand Together. Practitioner is a new one for me, so I'm going to try to live up to that standard. What I think you're referencing is the Americans for Prosperity and Americans for Prosperity action effort in the 2024 election. And so we are a big supporter of this effort. And it's a big one. It's a heavy lift to try to improve the outcomes of this election, better candidates that will pass better policy more in line with the principles of freedom and progress. And to understand the effort, I think it's useful to kind of take a step back and really acknowledge the context within which this effort is taking place, the elections that are taking place. And a lot of this has been covered in previous panels today, but the disruption that people are experiencing right now is causing nothing short of a massive realignment, the kind of realignment that I think happens only once in several generations. And so, to my mind, it's no longer so much about left versus right, although that's important, but it's often more about top-down versus bottom-up, sort of this tendency towards authoritarianism that we're seeing on both the left and the right. And you know a whole lot about this as the challenge. But when you understand that that's what's going on and you look and apply that to politics, you see this downward spiral that's happening in our elections. And we've seen this over the past few cycles where Republicans are nominating, in many cases, terrible candidates that advocate for policies that you wouldn't recognize from Republicans in the past and really go against kind of the core principles of the country. And in response, the Democrats are doubling down on more extreme positions that also go against these core principles of freedom and progress. And so you've got this competition for who can be worse. And it's in that context that we are seeing the challenge of this election. And so that's the bad news. The good news is that the American people are smarter than our politicians, and they are consistently rejecting this sort of race to the bottom. And there's lots of ways to understand that, but the easiest is to look at what's happened to many of these bad candidates from the Republicans over the past 3 cycles. They're losing. And then there's lots of other ways that hopefully we'll talk more about where the American people are on these ideas. But it's in that context that we asked ourselves, okay, so if the American people are smarter than what's happening in retail politics, why do we continue to get these bad candidates? And why do we have the kind of dynamic that we've got right now throughout the country, best exemplified by the top of the ticket, the presidential race? And it's a primary problem, right? And that's obvious, and people understand that. The challenge is, what's the solution to the primary problem, right? If you only have a very small percentage of people in the election choosing candidates, and then everybody else has to choose often amongst bad options, you got to fix the primaries. And while there's lots of reform efforts that I think are very much worth looking at, they all take way too long. And we don't have way too long. We got to do something now. And that's where Americans for Prosperity, Americans for Prosperity Action's strategy comes in. It's an obvious answer. It took us a little while to figure it out. But the answer to the primary problem is more voters, right? So if you've only got 4%, 7%, 9% of voters choosing candidates in primaries, bringing in a relatively small number of new voters, in this case into the Republican presidential primaries, can make a big difference in the outcome, the selection of candidates. And so that's what they're up to. This is an effort that started in earnest in May. So far, I just got a briefing from the team. They have reached out to contact nearly 6 million voters in the early primary states, knocking on their doors, giving them phone calls. And what they're finding is that there is a real opportunity to bring people who would like to vote in this primary election for the first time into the process. And importantly, to bring people who will vote for a candidate that can turn the page on the most recent political era and get to candidates that can actually offer a positive vision for the future, more in line with the principles that we're here to discuss.
It's a fascinating project. Heath, you're coming at the grassroots thing from a different angle. Tell us about your work.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what Brian said. I mean, I think the challenge that we face in this lane is a problem of political power, ultimately. We can evangelize ideas, we can talk about what we think is wrong with the policies, but at the end of the day, the reason we see elected officials who have traditionally agreed with us saying things that are just blatantly against those principles is because they don't see the political power and the political yield out there in the electorate if they say what they truly believe. And so changing that equation, like Brian was saying, with more voters, with just thinking very tactically, filled rooms of people that are cheering for them when they speak. I mean, you think about, our organization, the one thing that we do is we host a in-person gathering the same weekend of CPAC here in DC on the theory that there needs to be roomfuls of voters who believe in our ideas, and that people ought to, when Mike Pence gives his populism versus conservatism speech, people need to see roomfuls of voters who agree with Mike Pence cheering Mike Pence. And our theory of the case, at least at Principles First, is that there are in fact roomfuls of those voters who will cheer for those principles still, and particularly when we're at a moment when everyone, as the other panel was saying, is so frustrated with the two choices that we have on offer. It's a moment for freedom and innovation and disruption, both in what we're saying, but how we're doing it. So I really do think voters in rooms, meeting people where they are, not just in DC, but in Kansas City. We go and do meetups with people, with just people who see what we're talking about on social media. We'll go to Kansas City, Salt Lake, and just 10, 15, 20 people at a time. But that to me is really the way democracy is working, particularly right now. So I'm glad to be on this panel and the work that people are doing, but I really think that is an important metric that sometimes the Republican Party of the 90s or even the early 2000s, the Republican Party that was disrupted by populist angst, it loses sight of the fact that ultimately this is a game of votes and voters.
John, you come at this from obviously someone who's very politically astute as well, but your role in the ecosystem is to think a bit more maybe in the longer term, or maybe it is short term as well. I mean, you're thinking about a lot of these same issues, but how to support individuals and institutions that can move the ball down the field. What are you seeing out there, and what are you working on?
Well, I think what I'll articulate, the strategy that the Polk Foundation and its philanthropic partners are pursuing is consistent with expand the electorate. It's consistent with engage voters at the grassroots, but it's different. It's distinct. It's a little bit like it's a kind of a version of the chicken and egg problem. Do leaders do what they do because that's how they believe they will remain leaders? In other words, are they taking the cues from their followers? Or do people who follow leaders tend to adopt the behavior and even the specific policy positions of the people they've already chosen are their leaders for other reasons? I would submit to you that this is actually a question that has been studied a lot in the political science literature, and it is mostly the latter. So it is not, I wish these jerks in Washington would act better, but it's actually because the jerks back home want them to be jerks, is not really the main mechanism. The main mechanism is the other way. We're weirdos. Everybody in this room, you're weird. Because, well, not necessarily just because you're in this room, but kind of. It's because most people, most of the time, do not spend a lot of their mental energy on politics, and thank goodness. What that means is that when they're making decisions about who they're going to vote for or who they look up to, if it's separate from an election campaign and it's which public figure do I admire, which media figure do I follow, which publication, which channel, which social media account, whatever it is, a lot of that, contrary to what we all might want to believe given our various vocations, is not based on a persuasive appeal. It is not based on specific issues that they have a list of 5 issues and they check down the list and they so Ovik wrote something in Forbes. They say, well, now, I don't know about this, but these other 2 and this one I'll give him a 2.5. That is not the way people actually in the real world operate. They tend to be drawn to people who they perceive to be people who represent them in a kind of an identitarian sense or an aspirational sense. And if that person, that male or female leader that they admire, then on a question where most people don't have a strong opinion, we've talked a lot at this conference in the last 2 days about trade policy as an example. Most Americans, most of the time, have no opinion of any consequence about trade policy. It's just not something they think about. They don't have to think about it. That's fine. They don't need to think about it. A lot of times they're going to take their lead on things that are not deeply personal, like abortion, but are more abstract. They're going to take their lead from their leaders. Leaders matter. Leaders are leaders because they have followers. There's actually a great political science book on this some years ago called Follow the Leader, and it's all about this. So the reason I expound on that at some length is because a lot of our work at the Pope Foundation, and specifically related to our Future of Freedom initiative and the subsequent Freedom Conservatism project that Ovik and I and others have been working on, a lot of that is about ideas, yes, but ideas really don't have consequences on their own. Ideas really are the currency we're working with, but the real investments that matter are 3 other I's. They're individuals, you've already alluded to 2 of them, individuals, institutions, and interconnections. A lot of what we do with our work, increasingly so, is identify people, whether they are well-established opinion leaders or political actors or whatever, or they're up-and-comers, they're emerging intellectual, academic, political leaders. Identify those individuals. What do they need to get to the next level? What kinds of investments have already been made on them? What kinds of investments can we come alongside and help make in them to make them even more effective advocates? Second, institutions. Actually, ideas, the competition of ideas is in many ways really more a competition of institutions because it's about who do you trust. We wish it was that very well-written 1,200-word essay, but it's more who published it, who read it, who sent me the link to it. I may never actually read it. You know, of course, the vast majority of links on social media are never clicked through. They're just, I click to this and I quote something. That's all that person will see, and it's me endorsing. Institutions, whether they be public policy organizations or political parties or churches or universities or businesses or other kinds of community associations, it is not only the case that the withering of these institutions makes big government more likely, which is true, and it is not only the case that big government growing bigger tends to compress these institutions, because that's another chicken and egg problem, but it is also the case that if we don't affirmatively work to create, and particularly institutions that already exist, to hold them accountable, to improve them, to, as you've been working on, to hold them accountable for their own principles, to hold the leaders accountable for their own principles, and to build these institutions and strengthen and preserve the credibility of these institutions, we're out of the game. And that's a lot of what our work is doing now, is looking at particular institutions that we believe are worth investing more in, worth building their brands, building their capacities, focusing them in on their core value. And then finally, interconnectedness. A lot of what our freedom conservatism work has been doing, right, Ovik, is really this person thought this way, this person thought this way, this institution's been working, but they really haven't been talking, they haven't been collaborating, they haven't been learning from each other, they haven't been amplifying each other's voices. So those individuals and institutions and the messengers that they represent, the strength of their influence, again, we think it's because of the ideas. Freedom is good. It is good. It's not enough. It has to be effective messengers credible messengers, messengers that people will believe. And so a lot of the interconnectedness work that we're doing is encouraging networks of individuals, networks of institutions, lean into their comparative advantages. You already do that? Great. I'm not going to try to do that. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to send people to you, and you're going to send people to me, and we're going to get a higher rate of return on our donors' investment. So that's a lot of what we've been thinking about, is not as much grassroots up, but more thinking about leaders and institutions. It's not, I won't say it's sort of top down in the way that Brian means. It's not a central plan by the government, but it is absolutely a belief that leaders matter. They have disproportionate power in any society. Free societies, socialist societies, theocracies, it doesn't matter. Leaders, there will always be a relatively small number of people who have disproportionate influence on political conversations, political outcomes, agenda setting, and we want those leaders to be, as much as possible, our people.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience. What is the one thing that you think our movement really needs that nobody is currently doing?
I think my answer to that is goes back to what John was saying. An identity, a brand, an alternative to the red hat that is not attached to a personality, and it's rooted in ideas. But it is a. I mean, our politics is working in a tribal way, and we can fight that all we want and say we need to come together. But at the end of the day, if you want to start winning those primaries and changing who's going, you really need a different way for just the average middle-of-the-road Republican to identify. Because right now, the only jersey that they can put on is that red hat. And the red hat symbol has come to symbolize, because of the chaotic nature of that intellectual side of the party. I mean, it's sort of sprouted up overnight. But it doesn't represent the types of principles that of freedom and liberty and opportunity that we stand for, and so we got to recreate that.
Is that a third party? Is that a
I
no
don't,
labels kind of? What is
I
it?
think of it in terms of I think the Tea Party is a good example of this. That was a brand. That was a banner that was raised. It wasn't a party. It was a faction in our politics. And right now, look, I'm not mincing any words. We're not 50 plus 1% of the Republican Party. We're 10, 15%. But when Trump came down the escalator, he was not at 50 plus 1%. He lifted a banner, he lifted a brand in our discourse, and it attracted millions of Americans. Not, I would submit, like you said, John, because he had a 15-page paper, but he had an ethos, he had a brand that people rallied to. And that, I think, is what our movement lacks, is a single banner where a lot of leaders can stand under it to say this is what we represent. We have disagreements, we come at things different ways, but this is who we are as conservatives, as Americans.
Let me build on that, because I think the answer to your question is actually embedded in the question. I think what our movement needs is a movement. We're not actually a movement in the classical sense. We talk about the movement. There's a lot of the components to it, and this isn't a criticism of any one individual player, but the answer is sort of embedded in what these two guys just said. What do movements have? Right? Movements have ways for people to identify without having to absorb 15 pages is modest. How many people when was the last time you saw a think tank publish a 15-page paper, right? That's a brief. These are tomes. We need a way for people to identify and be excited, right? I used to work with a guy named Russ Roberts. Many of you know Russ. A phenomenal thinker. Russ used to say, nobody's sitting around the campfire singing songs about tax cuts. I wish they were, right? Russ is a Milton Friedman trained economist. And he could write songs. He'd be there, but nobody else would be there. We need a way for people to get engaged. And part of that is that we've got to have the courage of our convictions. We've got to stop apologizing for the principles that have driven progress for centuries in our country. So when we see a problem, we've got to hit it hard, right? The challenge with free markets, to my mind, is not that they don't solve the problems that people care about. It's that we've been too tentative and actually leaning into the principles and implementing solutions based on these principles, based on markets, for instance. And I think when we have the courage of our conviction, when we can make a clear case that these ideas solve the problems that people care about, and they do it better than the alternative, then we're going to get the kind of thing that John's talking about. We're going to get leaders that are going to have to lead on these principles if they want people to follow them, right? And so it's not going to be, hey, how can we marshal ourselves behind the red hats or whoever the hats are, because maybe we believe with about 15% of what they want. We're going to say those guys better stand out and lead in front of us, right? Or else we're going to go somewhere else. So there's a lot of things that we have a lot of the ingredients to do, but we haven't yet sort of coalesced as this ecosystem, this movement, which can really make the case that these are the ideas that are going to lead the country forward. And I think, there's nothing like a crisis to focus one's attention. And we are at a crisis moment right now for a lot of reasons of it that you've pointed out in your writing. It's an existential moment for those of us who believe in a free society. And it's a chance for us to really kind of step up and complete the sentence, kind of connect the dots, and really become that movement that the country needs us to be right now, if we're gonna make the kind of progress that we can make.
Well, I certainly agree. I agree that having a brand is important. I agree that building that brand around some compelling ideas is important. I think people, particularly on the right side of the spectrum, conservatives who believe in freedom, might want to think about freedom and conservative together, maybe freedom, conservatism together. It's a great idea. But let me go in a different direction. Here's something we need that I don't think we seriously have yet. There's a lot of lip service to it, but not really. Chris Sununu, the Governor Sununu, actually alluded to this towards the end of his remarks this morning when he talked about, I would never want to be in the U.S. Senate. Now, he actually did consider it. But lots of people say things like that right before they run for U.S. Senate. And lots of people come back to their jurisdiction from their House seat that they have held for many terms and talk about that town, Washington's a city, it's not a town. So as soon as a politician talks about things in this town, that's BS. Okay, they're spinning your little web. So they don't really want to solve problems, many of them. The ones who do want to solve problems find it more compelling, well, maybe next term, maybe the term after that. The truth is that our movement, to be an effective movement, a serious movement for freedom and progress, needs to be serious about devolving power from Washington. Not, that's a nice talking point, we'll put it in our speech, but literally, this is not something those yahoos will ever do. They will never fix certain problems. It never will happen. We need to stop letting them try. I think we need a serious effort for a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It has to be written carefully so it's not screwy. But unless we take seriously the notion that the rules of the game make it impossible for federal finances to be controlled, which it does, we have to change the rules of the game. We have to move decisions to states, move decisions to localities. That means, for example, if there's a Republican administration and it wants to mandate things on California, we've got to say no. Let California be California. That's a little different than what we're used to seeing, which is on the Republican side or the conservative side, when there's a Democratic administration in Washington, federal government's too big and Washington has too much power and power to the people and bring things back home. And when there's a Republican administration and they do things through executive order and the Democratic governors say, well, actually they're telling us what to do. We were elected by our constituents and we can make our own decisions in Vermont. It's inconsistent. And I think the public is rightly distrustful of everybody. So I think that our movement, I think we need a serious effort. There are some effort. The State Policy Network, of which I'm a board member, has been working a lot on a new Center for Practical Federalism. There's some other groups that are working on this subject that are serious about it, not just lip service about it. But the truth is that lots more governors need to come to some future Freedom and Progress Conference or get the Frederick Douglass Award and honestly say, I never even thought about running for Congress. When I finish my second term as governor, I'm going back to run my company or start a law firm or teach at a university or become mayor of my hometown or something like that. That would be a sign of real progress.
And just to double down on that, John, I think you're absolutely right in calling for the devolution of power away from Washington, but let's not stop at the states, right? I mean, most of the decisions ought to be made in civil society, in voluntary society, where people have the incentives to cooperate and find new and better solutions, rather than just sort of cling to power, even at the state level. And the more that we can consider solutions in the private sector, in the voluntary civil society part of our movement, right, the more that we're going to have the numbers on our side, the compelling stories to show people how they can be part of this, even if they're not interested in reading those 15-page papers. I think there's a lot of strength that we haven't gone to help make the case for a free society.
I agree with that. I'm thinking in terms of mastication. You know, first the food, you chop it here, then you move it back and you grind it some more, and you move it back and you grind it some more. We've got to take the first bite.
Fair enough, fair enough.
Questions? Or I see a hand up in the back there. So the question was, how do you break through to the person who has, I think it was a high school education and a mediocre job, who feels that the economy which he perceives as free market has failed him? How do you reach to that? How do you reach that person?
Well, I would say, first of all, I mean, it's a common question. It's a good question. There are some people who are not persuadable, but I'm an optimist. I think not very many. The first thing I would say is that there are lots and lots of people right now who live in or have just moved to places where they feel pretty good about the economy, at least for them, because they just got a new job and it was better. They're not college graduates necessarily, but they moved to a place that is freer, that is more dynamic, where there are more jobs being created. They did have a lackluster job where they moved from. They have a better job now. They're a little worried about being able to afford housing because the housing prices are spiking in high growth areas. But the point I'm making is to assume that everyone who is not a college graduate and has feelings of alienation about the federal government, to assume that all of them are hostile to the market, I think is, again, to over-intellectualize. It's the kind of thing that we say at conferences in this town. But actually, most people don't think in those political terms. They just think about jobs. The simplest way to make people, the kinds of people that you're describing, more friendly to our ideas is to implement them effectively and make their communities better, and they see. I mean, some of it is a rhetorical, persuasive challenge. Some of it is actual get results. There are places where freedom-oriented people are in charge and making decisions and making their economies better. People are feeling better about it. They're re-electing those public officials. They're giving them more power. There is a positive feedback loop happening in many communities, many states, not all. The second thing I would say about this is, of course, we all know that a lot of the actual rap, a lot of the actual blame that can be attached to whatever happened to that particular disaffected worker is not about the free market. It's about crony capitalism. It's about bad public policies. It's about bad education, flawed educational alternatives, if we can call them that this worker was afforded when he or she was younger. It's all sorts of things that government is actually doing to that person, to that person's family, to that person's community. Obviously, we have to articulate that effectively. But I'm quite serious that the most important, again, I'm a kind of leaders before followers person. We need to get our leaders to make good decisions, to stick to them when it's politically difficult, to make good public policies, because overall results speak more than anything else. Examples are more effective than abstract data.
And I'll just highlight on that, at FreeOp, this is literally all we do. Every single solution or policy proposal we come up with has to meet two tests. Test number one is it results in a net expansion of liberty. Test number two is that it has a meaningful impact on the lives of Americans whose incomes or wealth are below the US median. So that's literally the only thing we do. And my colleague, Michael Frank, who's here somewhere in the crowd, he's actually developing a project where we'll kind of collate all of our best ideas in that regard for public consumption, and we'll make sure that we share that with you when it comes out.
I think it's a great question, and it ultimately boils down to what is the story that you're going to tell that voter? And you could tell them a story about we've abandoned Reaganism and we need to go back to Reaganism, and if we just got the government out of the way, then our free markets could work again. And that's a story you could tell, but it feels like, at least politically, that story is not selling as well as it used to politically. I would submit that the story that we have to tell is we have to enlist that person and those workers into a vision or a cause of America that isn't, your problems are your neighbor's fault. I mean, the story, the narrative that person is being sold, the narrative that, any other, you pick a constituency, and the narrative that they're being sold by some enterprising politician is that they are a victim. The reason their wages are down is because someone else took their job. And that is not a united American story that enlists that worker in a vision. Getting back to brand and story and narratives that you can imagine a story there from a leader who is willing to disrupt our current swim lanes that completely enlists a different set, electoral coalition to move us forward. But I think it's not just the economy, stupid, I guess, is what I would say. It's a much broader narrative and vision for the country that I don't think we hear in our politics right now, I would say.
I think we also need to acknowledge that the American people tend to be a lot smarter than a lot of folks give them credit for being. And I think to that worker, we have to first give them the courtesy of respect, and we have to give them the credit that they can understand the cause of their problem. And in fact, the answer I think is embedded in the question. If their concern is that the rich are colluding with government to make their lives harder, there's a lot of truth in that. And the answer can't be, so let's have more government who can collude even more with some other rich person to make your life even harder, right? And people understand that. We know they understand that, because when you look at, where are people choosing to move, right? Where are they voting with their feet? We focus a lot on federal policy, which is a big challenge. But there's quite a lot of experimentation happening in the states. And consistently, the people who do know what's best for them are moving to those places that best reflect these ideas. And so I think that the discussion of populism, we really need to kind of separate into two issues. One is the problems that are motivating people, and I think that those are very real problems, and people deserve our respect to really work with them to understand those problems. And then there are the solutions that are being offered in the name of populism, which are not solutions to those problems. They are ideas that will make those problems much, much worse. And that's a pretty straightforward discussion if we don't confuse the two issues.
Great. All right. Next question.
Yeah. I'm Jibai from Johns Hopkins. I have a question regarding the morality. So I teach accounting at Johns Hopkins to graduate students. And you can tell they are very sentimental and they care about morality. They do not like conservatives because they believe, most of them believe conservatives are very immoral. They're bad. But after 8 weeks of accounting, you tell them free market, you tell them how the collective wisdom is the best, and the people in government have no superior morality or intelligence. And then at the end of the course, you can feel they really on average tend much on the right. So my question to the panel is, what do you think about the potential of the possibility of linking conservatism with morality? Thank you.
The question is linking conservatism and morality. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we could actually link the government to GAAP accounting? That would be like a massive political win. But go ahead, guys. Is that the way to engage the public and advance the stuff? We all talk about the morality and the first principles, but maybe we're not doing it in the right way, I think is part of what Gia is implying.
Well, here's what I think about that. First of all, different audiences respond favorably or unfavorably to different words. So some people hear morality and they want to listen. Some people hear morality and want to turn off. But ethics or principles or character or so it kind of depends on the audience as to what term you want to use. Let me lean into character because I think that one has very few abstract critics. There's a lot of people, their practice shows they don't care about it. But almost everybody pays lip service to it, which is good. Let's start there. I think that it is underappreciated how much character or the perception of character, the perception of strength that isn't just physical, but is sort of moral strength, is very attractive to people. It is not an ideological distinction. It's not an ideological process that people come to when they are attracted to people with character or not. But character matters a great deal. What we're seeing now, as was alluded to in the last panel, is the potential for a rerun of a presidential race from 2020 in which a large chunk of Americans think both of the major party candidates lack character, which means, as Brian has said several times already, the American people are pretty smart. That suggests not so much, I don't have a specific opinion or suggestion of how to fix the 2024 scenario, but in the longer term, we should be thinking not just about the compelling stories, which are essential. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We are not rational calculating machines. So it has to be about stories you would tell around the campfire. It's true. And it isn't just about brands and making things simple and explaining how abstract ideas can have practical benefits for people in their lives. All of that's true. But I think we have to lift up leaders, not just potential political leaders, but all kinds of leaders, leaders in business, leaders in nonprofits, leaders in communities, that show character. People respond favorably to that, and they should. And furthermore, if my thesis is true about leaders, about followers following the leaders more than the other way around, the more leaders we cultivate and build up as exemplars of character, the more character we will have in the rest of our society. I believe character is a very important part of the freedom movement, is to embrace character. It is in the short run, you might get a few scurrilous, people to do some good things for freedom. But in the long run, that will blow up in our face. We need people who have character.
Brian, I can't remember if you and I have talked about this before, but there is a movement out there to say the primary system is a historical accident. It exacerbates a lot of these problems. We would have higher character, higher quality candidates if we had nonpartisan primaries, ranked choice voting, some of these other tools that allow the middle 80% of the country to have more of a say in who our leaders are. Do you buy that argument?
Well, I don't think it's the most important argument to be having right now. So that's a bit of a dodge. I'll tell you how I feel about ranked choice voting and some of these electoral reforms. I think that in some instances they would improve on the margins that the people who are advocating for them say they would. I think in almost all cases it's greatly exaggerated in terms of how much of a difference they would make. But I think there's a lot more work to be done before these things are ready for prime time. And that, to me, is the most important point in this discussion. When I look at what's happening right now in elections, the biggest challenge that we've got is people don't trust them. And if you don't trust the elections, right, basically everything is up for grabs, and you kind of get the situation that we're all living through right now. And so whether or not some of these electoral structural reforms would improve outcomes and bring more people in and that sort of thing over time, because it will take a long time for them to be implemented, is an important discussion, but it's not what we should be focused on right now, because I think if you were to introduce those the way that some of these ballot initiatives are, for instance, you're going to risk that thing that is so fragile right now, which is trust. Because say what you will about them, they are very complicated, and they are not quite ready for prime time. So I think solutions like the ones that Americans for Prosperity have discovered, which just say, look, the problem right now is that, 85% of the population identifies as the exhausted majority. The problem is that they don't see a path to sort of get engaged right now, so let's bring more of them into the process as it exists. I think that's the way that we can make the difference right now. And then, let's continue to look to improve upon the primary system, which is, as you say, an accident of history. Because we can always do better, but I think we've got to make sure that at a time that is as fragile as it is right now, that we're putting our energy in the areas that can make the greatest difference.
Go ahead. I just want to touch back and thinking about the moral question and about this idea that conservatives are bad, and how do we think about moral formation as a movement, and how we talk about, and your question, Avik, was how do we talk about morality? Because I think the tendency is it's very easy to just look around the country and think, geez, we're going to hell in a handbasket here. I mean, there's corruption, there's lying and dishonesty everywhere. It's easy to stand up and say, why don't you guys all just be moral, like us, right? And I think that is actually, it's not a good recipe for political success. It causes retrenchment. It causes, everybody starts pointing fingers at everyone. And I think that this is a key ingredient to that movement, or whatever it is that's going to emerge. For it to be successful, we have to have a smart way to talk about moral formation, because it is such a critical challenge that the country faces. One answer, potentially, I don't know the answer, but one answer potentially is that, we are not going to be a moral society just because we elect your candidate to town council. Don't look to the government for your morality. We form our morality as a country, as a nation, at the baseball field on the weekends, in the town square when we're talking to people over lunch or whatever. Put the burden back on to Americans to form morality in themselves and in their neighbors on a day-to-day basis. I don't hear that sort of take responsibility message out there right now. Just a thought.
That's great. Okay, I think we probably have time for one more question. Is there anyone out there? Okay, we got lots of hands up. Dealer's choice. Oh, you got the mic. Great.
Yes, thank you. I would like to invite our panel to think one more about the term that has been used very often in this session, populism, about appropriateness of this term. So far, nobody has proposed any reasonable definition of this particular term, because it's not clear. What is it? Is it political system? Definitely not. Is it particular ideology? Definitely not. What is it? It looks like, based on the root, it is the same word in Latin, what is democracy in Greek. It's power of people, or power to people. So the reinvention of this term happened around 2015 in Britain, with very particular purpose to just, on the far left, to blame somebody on the right flank of the political spectrum with very clear political purposes, just to denigrate them. Whether it has any particular sense, it's a big question. So essentially, what many people are talking about populism, about those who receive political power but do not share our views about freedom, liberty, and rule of law. But it is not a problem of populism, it's a problem of democracy.
Who was Havel? There was a Czech poet who had a poem about, if you don't like what the people have decided, fire the people and get a new one. I'm botching the quote. But to me, that's what I think of as populism. Is it all depends on how you define who the people are. And the people who call themselves populists are often very careful about who they think the people actually are.
I think there's going to be a lot that has to shake out in terms of the language and all of that. I think it's a very good call out. My sense, though, is that the real question of our time is, are we as a society going to choose to solve problems by seeking power over people? Or are we going to commit to the principles that have always made progress in our country by empowering people to solve those problems in new and different ways? And so we'll figure out over the next several years what the camps are called. But I think that ultimately is the fundamental question that's at stake right now. And it's a really important one. It's really important that we get it right.
I think that Brian's instincts are good here. We don't have enough time. Even if we had another hour, we couldn't adequately explore the meaning of populism, the various meanings of populisms. Of course, it is a style, but it is also somewhat of a body of political ideas. It has a history. America has had populist movements since the early 1800s, but they're quite different. I mean, the Jacksonian populism movement bears almost no relationship to the current populist movement in ideological content, but some of the style is similar, but the policies are quite different. So here's what I would say about it is a sense that leaders have misled us, that institutions have failed, that in particular, federal politicians, federal power has been misused for the good of special interest groups instead of us, we the people. That's a real instinct. It's something we can work with. We don't need to label it.
Heath, any final thoughts from you?
Not too much to add, other than I think for me at least, when I think about populism that we currently face, it boils down to a political lens of rewarding my friends and punishing my enemies. That's completely devoid of any kind of substantive, independent, neutral principle about how I think the world should be. That is just, there is some emotion out there among people. There's an angst, and I'm going to scratch that itch by punishing another group. And it could manifest in any number of ways, but that, once we start playing politics that way, it's a completely different, we can't even really, it's a completely different argument than arguing on ideas and principles, because theoretically, what I promote as a way of doing society or policy or anything, it could be agnostic to who it rewards and who it helps, because what it should do is help the entire country and everyone. It should be the recipe for collective national success. And I see populism as a political strategy rooted in victimization and identity. It's like, who is the populist group that you're serving is really important to populism. But again, like you say, John, we're not. There's many flavors in many ways, and it would take us a while to pull all those threads.
Well, I think what you're all saying is that the highest Platonic form, or maybe it's Aristotelian form of populism, is one which advances the interests of all people. And I think that's what we all stand for in this room. So thank you all very much for being here, for all the fine work you do to make that happen. Appreciate it.